China overtakes the US as Canada's biggest crude oil customer. The expansion of the Trans Mountain Pipeline has altered Canada's role in global crude markets, shifting a trade pattern that for decades favored the United States toward a new Pacific-facing reality in which China emerges as Canada's largest customer for exported crude. The pipeline's increase in capacity to 890,000 barrels per day in 2024 allowed Canadian producers to reach Pacific ports and, combined with changing geopolitical dynamics and China's active stockpiling, produced a rapid reorientation of flows toward Asia. Before the expansion, Canadian crude was overwhelmingly oriented southward toward U.S. refineries because Alberta's oil production is landlocked and pipeline capacity constrained. The Trans Mountain expansion tripled export capacity to the Pacific, enabling crude to be loaded onto tankers in British Columbia and shipped to Asian buyers. That physical access reduced the logistical discount that previously penalized Canadian heavy crude and created a direct route to large Asian demand centers. The practical effect has been immediate. Ship tracking and market data show average flows to China of roughly 207,000 barrels per day after the expanded pipeline ramped up, compared with about 173,000 barrels per day to the U.S. in the same window. At certain moments, as much as 70% of cargoes departing British Columbia have been headed to Chinese ports, signaling a structural change in destination patterns for Canadian crude. China's rising share of Canadian exports is not only about geography, it is driven by strategic choices and global policy shifts. Chinese refiners and state buyers have been actively stockpiling crude amid price weakness and have sought to diversify away from supplies that are subject to U.S. sanctions or political pressure. The U.S. trade posture and earlier sanctions on Russian and Venezuelan crude made Canadian barrels comparatively attractive as a politically stable source, accelerating China's purchases from the new Pacific Gateway. For China, building inventory and expanding storage capacity, several new large sites are being added, serves energy security objectives and gives the country flexibility in global markets. For Canada, selling into Asia reduces concentration risk and increases bargaining leverage, but it also introduces new geopolitical dimensions to energy trade relations with both the U.S. and Asian buyers. Opening Pacific access narrowed the price differentials that had punished Canadian heavy crude. The Western Canadian Select benchmark benefited from improved market access, leading to stronger realized prices and margins for producers who had long argued that constrained pipeline access depressed national revenue. The expansion has increased terminal throughput in British Columbia and raised utilization metrics for Trans Mountain, with utilization expected to rise further as demand from Asia continues to grow. At a system level, diversified export routes improve resilience against region-specific demand shocks and give Canadian producers optionality to sell to the highest value market. That optionality can reduce the long-run incentive for further discounts and support continued capital allocation to oil sands and heavy oil production, at least while global demand persists. The pivot to Asia intensifies domestic debates in Canada about reconciling economic gains from expanded fossil fuel exports with climate commitments and Indigenous and coastal marine concerns. The Trans Mountain project has drawn sustained opposition from environmental groups and some Indigenous communities over spill risks, coastal impacts, and the broader implications for Canada's net zero trajectory. Policymakers face the complex task of balancing near-term economic benefits and job support against long-term decarbonization goals and reputational risks on the international stage. Proponents argue that exporting Canadian crude with comparatively stringent environmental standards can displace higher-emission alternatives elsewhere. Critics counter that locking in new export infrastructure risks prolonging dependence on hydrocarbons and undermines Canada's stated climate goals. The tension between these positions will shape investment, regulatory choices, and the pace of complementary measures such as carbon capture and emissions intensity reductions in the oil sands sector. The emergence of China as a leading buyer of Canadian crude is a material shift with three broad implications. First, it transforms Canada from a regional supplier primarily tied to U.S. demand into a global supplier integrated with Asia's energy security strategies. Second, it makes infrastructure investments and export diversification decisive levers of economic and geopolitical influence for Canada. Third, it complicates domestic policy by forcing trade-offs between resource development and climate commitments. Near-term, continued Chinese stockpiling and weak global prices could sustain strong flows from the Pacific corridor, but demand elasticity, storage build-out, and macroeconomic performance in Asia will determine how durable this reorientation is. Domestically, debates over additional pipeline capacity, the potential revival of other cross-border projects, and the environmental governance of export infrastructure will continue to shape Canada's energy future. The Trans Mountain expansion did more than add capacity, it unlocked new markets and reframed Canada's energy diplomacy. The result is a concrete example of how infrastructure, market forces, and geopolitics combine to rewrite trade patterns and create new strategic choices for producer nations.